Alrighty, so at this point in your assembly, you should have your main board all soldered up and everything. You should have tested it already without the battery to make sure that the LCD turns on and whatnot. You should have your buttons properly set down and everything, and we will have checked to make sure that everything is flat as possible, so that way when we assemble this part, the casing and everything will go together. So the things you should have at this point when we're helping you is you should have your top part, which will go on top here. You should have your backboard, and then you should have 2 of each of these parts right here, which will kind of help. We'll show you where they go, but they'll kind of help to interconnect. And then you should have 4 screws and 4 of these plastic washers along with the battery at this point. All right, so first thing you want to do, which we did off camera, is you're going to want to peel that brown stuff off of these 2 faceplates and whatnot. So you should have both of your faceplates like this, just set up, ready to go. Now, the best way to do this is kind of assembling it from bottom up to begin with. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to want to start with this piece right here. Then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go ahead and angle both of these onto the board itself. One thing to make sure as well with all these parts is make sure that you can actually get a screw through. We've tested these for the most part to make sure that they can, but you don't want to assemble all this and realize, oh, one of these, the screws won't go through one of these parts, and you have to pull everything apart and redo it again. So before you start assembling anything, make sure the screws go through all the part, and we'll show you how the stack is at the end of this video, but then we'll just keep going through. So you have this part. Then the next part comes is the battery holder, which is this here, which will actually be facing, as shown here, will be facing into the board, face like this, just like that. Now what you do with the actual battery is a little bit different. You have these lithium batteries, and you need to be very careful with this next part here, because these batteries are very fragile, they are flammable, there needs to be some care with it. So notice how with the final assembly, we have the writing face downwards like this. The reason we did it this way is because what you want to do is you very carefully kind of want to straighten this wire ever so out. You don't need to pull, you don't need to do a ton of pressure and everything like that, but kind of just work it out of the tape and everything like that. You want to be very careful not to damage the circuit board and everything, because that's kind of what controls battery, but just kind of pressing down, bending the wire until it gets close to sticking out straight like this. Then what you're going to do is you're going to take your board at this point, you're going to flip it over like this. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take it and you're going to put the battery into the holder here. As you can see, there is a notch for the wire to go through the battery at this point. So you're going to kind of want to fit the battery into it as best you can. And then from there, once you've done that and you make sure nothing's pinching, it's really important to make sure nothing's pinching. You're going to set it down onto the board like so, like that. And then what you're going to do is very carefully, you're going to kind of wrap it around, making sure it doesn't poke anything. You're going to watch these 2 points right here and right here, making sure it doesn't poke anything. And you're going to slowly press it into this connector here until you are able to kind of get it. You may have to fight it just a little bit. Don't be scared of trying to press it into the connector, but you'll know it'll go all the way in once you're connected. So at this point, we now have the wires where we want it situated. Nothing's poking them, so there's no risk of a fire. And now we kind of have like our protector here. At this point, now that we have it assembled, you're going to want to make sure everything's kind of flush. You're going to very carefully kind of hold it as best you can with just 2 fingers. I kind of find is the best method. And you're going to flip it over ever so carefully. And you're going to kind of angle it downwards, and then you're just going to set it down just like that. So it's angled, and you're just kind of very carefully make sure everything's lined up as best as possible, just to make your life a little bit easier. All right, now that you have your board kind of facing here, one really important thing to make sure is that all your buttons are pressed down very firmly at this point, because if it comes loose while you're assembling this top piece, it can be a pain getting them back on properly and whatnot. And you kind of want to make sure, this is kind of like the last hurrah. You can still leave your LCD screen protector on. It's pretty easy to get off, but make sure everything is how you want it on this board and everything's working properly before you start assembling the next bits. At this point, you're going to add the next 2 pieces right here, right on top. And then you're going to take your screen protector and you're going to align it with the joystick and the speaker holes right here, just like so. And you're going to make sure You're gonna get it over the buttons, and it may require a little bit of wiggling around to get it flat on the board, but you can get it pretty close pretty easily. But this is why it's also so important to make sure everything's flat on the board, because if it isn't, when you're soldering everything, when you're trying to get this casing on, it won't actually fit flat or properly at this point. So now that we have everything kind of put together at this point, what you're gonna do is you're gonna just push these 4 screws in, and you're gonna kind of align it until it goes all the way down. And you may have to fight it a little bit or wiggle some of the bottom parts around. You kind of wiggle each part down until you are able to get all 4 of these holes. Feel free to pick it up ever so slightly. You don't want to pick it up full the way to make sure it goes all the way through, and set that one down once you're done. You're gonna want to get all 4 of these screws in before you start tightening any of them, so that way you can make sure everything's flush and actually fitting the correct way and whatnot. So we're gonna go ahead and do that real quick. Okay, now that we have all 4, I know I cut, but just to kind of emphasize, we have all the 4 screws, they're kind of in and everything. You're gonna wanna very carefully make sure, kind of push down on the screws to make sure everything's still good. You don't wanna lift it up too suddenly because you could dislodge the battery, but you're gonna wanna very carefully kind of flip it up onto its side, and you're gonna wanna verify, if the camera will move over here real quick, that the battery container is still in place and everything, and it's not pinching anything at this point before you start screwing things down, which it still looks like it's good, it's in place, we're not pinching anything, so we're good to kind of start screwing things down. So what you're gonna wanna do now is you're gonna wanna take these washers, and you're just gonna wanna very carefully just screw each one of these down ever so slightly. And you can set it down at this point very carefully. Again, just making sure when you're moving it, you still apply pressure to all the points and everything, so that way things just don't just go flying and everything. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna just slowly screw each of these down as tightly as you can, hand snug, and just make sure that these are all tight at this point as best you can by hand. Now, when you're screwing these on, also be sure as well to kind of hold a finger underneath here, hold it to the back of the screw as well, so that way it's not turning. So that way you can kind of, as best you can, get it as tight as you can to the casing. Okay, at this point, once you've hand tightened them as best you can and you've made sure everything's done, one thing you'll want to do at this point, notice this one's still a little loose, but that's fine. It's all kind of held together at this point. At this point, what you're gonna wanna do is to make sure the battery is actually working, you're gonna wanna flip it on real quick, just to make sure. You should get an error message because we don't have the SD card plugged in, but make sure everything's working properly and there's nothing poking it, you don't have any issues, but to make sure everything's working. And we'll help check this at this point as well. We'll be here to help assemble it and everything, but you just wanna be really careful that you don't puncture the lithium battery, and you're very careful with it because it is a big fire hazard, but you do also wanna test at this point to make sure it's working and whatnot. So now that we have it hand tightened as best we can, what we can now do at this point is you can take a small screwdriver set, and you can take an appropriate screwdriver, something the size of this or whatever, and you can hold onto the back of the washer, and then you just tighten on to the screw. You want to be careful because these are plastic screws and everything, and they strip, which means that it'll be really hard to disassemble it later on, or that the plastic will kind of mold together and they won't act as screws anymore. So you want to be careful not to over tighten it. You just want to do a little bit of tightening, and I find just doing it on its side at this point, as long as you've made sure that you've hand tightened it enough where it's holding everything together, you can then just kind of do all 4 of these at this point and just kind of get a final little twist on it, make sure it's tight enough. But again, you don't need to go crazy on it at this point. Okay, once you finish just barely making sure they're just tight enough so that way nothing's gonna come loose, and you've made sure that everything's working at this point. What you can do then as your final step is flip it back over on its bottom side, and you can take some small cutters like this essentially, and in order to make sure that it can lie level or as level as possible, what you can do is you can clip the excess part off with these scissors right here. What's important to note about these scissors right here, as you can kind of see, is they have a bit of an angle. So what you really want to make sure when you're doing this is that they sit as flat as possible against the screw, so that way when you cut it, it sits flat against the washer just like that. So that way you can cut each one of these, and then if you decide to disassemble, it's still the correct length and everything like that, so you can re-pull everything apart if you have some issue or you want to swap the battery out later on with help, obviously. but that way you can just cut all of these and make it super flush. But yeah, that is kind of the end of the process. And at this point, you can obviously take some tweezers or just very carefully with your finger peel off the LCD screen. But at this point, you should have it programmed and ready to go. And so you just need to insert your SD card up here, up at the top, plug it in right here, turn it on, and ta-da, you should have your final working piece with everything. And it should be having volume as well, but for whatever reason, it probably is an option turned off for right now, but yeah. Okay, last thing before we end up as well is once you finish cutting them, when you're cutting them, these parts tend to go flying as well, so try and be very careful to make sure you keep all your parts and everything so we can throw them away properly. Another thing that you also want to be careful of, or not really be careful, but just to note, is that these are rechargeable. So one way you can recharge it is you can plug it into the USB-C like you did before to test the ESP32, but as long as you have it turned on, you should see a light lighting up here, and it'll actually recharge the battery with it on. You have to leave it on in order for it to recharge. But that is just one note as well, just as a tidbit for now that you finished assembling it and whatnot. But yeah, enjoy.